In the second part of this series about mind control, we began to look into the beginning of where the strong delusion started to be waged against humanity. If you listen to that information objectively with intent to understand, it's hard to deny that mental manipulation wasn't done. And that's why I took a great deal of time to explain the history and set the stage of what it was like before they really started with their programming. After watching that history, it should be easy to understand why I say that the television is the biggest weapon ever used against humanity. And we barely have gotten anywhere talking about it. When you really come to understand how deep this all is, and then understand that we all now walk with personal television sets in our hand, it's quite hard to deny that you have been mentally programmed. I mean, that's the whole business of the television and why ads exist in the first place. In the last part, when we ended, we were discussing some of the mental changes that the television brought to the world. And after discussing the changes from politics and TV journalism, I didn't want to overwhelm with information when considering the next two ways, being that they are also very huge in the grand scheme of how we are in this world today. So I want to continue this discussion so that you can clearly understand the mental war that has been waged against us all, starting with yourself maybe, or your parents, your grandparents, depending on your age, the baby boomers. The goal is that after you understand this, you can begin to peep the game being played and understand what was actually going on and has gotten even worse today. In this part of the series, we're going to deal with the civil rights agenda and the feminist movement of the 60s. We got a lot to talk about. Let's begin. Okay, so the first thing we must get into is the civil rights era. The civil rights agenda was a major part of the control of this era. It's not a coincidence that the civil rights era began at this time. For decades before the 60s, there was segregation and inequality, hate between both sides. And if you honestly think that what changed all of this was just a natural feeling of love and hope or activism, if you think those things changed this dynamic, you are entirely too naive. And I don't mean that to offend you. It was not love, hope, activism, or even the God of the Bible, Yahuwah, carrying this out. These changes came because the powers that be have had us on a path towards a new way of the world. And in order to bring about that agenda, Satan needed to change the minds of the people to be more aligned with this new way of thinking that he was producing. This change would not have been possible without the television. The television changed the narrative because it was designed to do so. It was all a program. But the program, it was not for the adults. Both of these sides were already set in their ways. I'm speaking of both white and black adults. The program of change was set and intended for the baby boomer generation. These minds were already in control of by a small few, and they were carefully being guided into following the path that was set for them in order to bring us to where we are today. So we need to understand it. We're going to start with the civil rights agenda. In discussing the civil rights agenda, it's important to know and understand that in the Negro community, it was not the adult Negroes from the silent generation that were generally excited about Michael King and his new movement. I'm not sure if that's common knowledge or not. There was a movie called The Butler. It took me a while to watch the movie because it just sounded boring, but it was actually a decent movie. I think it did a good job with showing the difference between the older generation and the younger generation in the Negro community. Now, one thing I hate about that movie, and all movies like that, is that they completely leave out and ignore the Prince Hall Freemasonry aspect of the main characters, which does not give a clear picture of truth to those watching. And of course they don't, but the Prince Hall Freemasonry is a big reason how these people were able to be around all those secrets. But anyways, the younger generation, which were these baby boomers, they grew up wanting revolution, and they followed men like Michael. Now, I made a video about Michael King and his so-called dream. So if you don't understand my issue with him, please make sure you watch that video. I'm not getting into it fully here, but I think that as I explain, you should be able to make this all out for yourself. Regardless of my feelings about him, the parents hated his movement, and they wanted their children to stay out of it. Listen to this conversation this man had with John Lewis. These two were part of those sit-ins.
Hey, this letter I got from my mother sort of disturbed me. It hurts me in a way, man. She said, "Dear son, I was glad to hear from you. And sorry, too, because I didn't sleep all night praying and crying and thanking God. He's been so good to you. What are you fighting for? You don't have a family. Yet you remember who are helping you in school. It is the white people. What about the people of your race? Well, what are they giving you? Remember, don't hurt yourself. Remember, your advisor asked the white people to help you. And they did. So you don't want to fight the people who are trying to help you. Remember, God will straighten out everything if you just give him time. You don't have to eat with the white people. And you live all these years, just pray and trust in God. You're not learning your lesson in school. God is nobody to play with. You're just making disturbance. See, she didn't even give her complimentary clothes or anything, man. She's really upset, man, but gosh, man. I mean, I know she cares for me, you know. I mean, I know she loves me, but man, she just don't understand. She just don't understand. You see what I mean?
The mother did not want her son in the movement and wanted him to trust in God. But he rejected his mother and said she just didn't understand. And they went out there pushing this agenda. And ironically, now as adults, our parents, who were these baby boomers, they chastise us, saying that we don't understand. So their parents didn't understand them, and us as their children don't understand them. They obviously were just a generation on their own. But I'm getting off track here. These young baby boomers, they didn't know how the world really worked. And some of these men were Masons and trying to move up the ladder, yes. But as a whole, the young people, they didn't really understand how the system worked. They just knew what they were told. So what I'm saying is that this civil rights movement that everyone today looks at as a great thing, it was not fully endorsed by the older generation. And I think that's important to know because that generation, they were not mentally programmed the same way. There was a rift between the programs. Now, depending on your view of the world at this time, you may not understand why I have an issue with all of this, being that I obviously take advantage of these rights that we have today. My view of that civil rights era is simple. I believe we either should have dealt with the hatred or fought back. But either way, we should have worked to keep our families together and keep the devil out of our homes and our lives. Once we signed to be equal, it was like signing a deal with the devil, giving the devil authority over our community, and we have never been the same since. You may disagree, and that's okay. That's not what I'm getting at. The point I want you to understand is that all the generations did not agree and support Michael King and the civil rights movement at first. And I bring this up for specific reasons. When you watch the footage of the civil rights movement, look at the age group of the people protesting and doing the sit-ins. Now, granted, these young people, they look a lot more mature than our young people today. Yes, they do. But they were still children. They were college students. They went to college and were recruited to be a part of the movement for change. And they did not respect their parents for not supporting them through it. It was the baby boomer generation that pushed for all this change, and it was them that was used to bring us into submission today. But hey, I get it. They truly thought what they were doing was right. So the better question to ask and understand the answer of is, why did they all of a sudden now have this conviction? The answer I'm sure you can guess. Yep, right here. This idiot box right here. You see, the TV journalism that I spoke about in part 2 began to cover civil rights demonstrations and began to soften as well as activate the hearts of the younger generation.
It was our responsibility to find a way to dramatize the issue.
Congressman John Lewis says that the movement's leaders realized to bring change, they needed to reach white Americans.
How did you do that?
As a movement, we literally put our bodies on the line.
Influence on the civil rights coverage.
Hank Klibanoff co-wrote The Race Beat, a book about the media and the movement.
Well, race was a big story in the South beginning in the 40s and 50s. It's just that no one knew about it.
Finally, by 1957, major northern newspapers discover the drama and the story.
How do you feel about integrated passengers?
The television networks followed. Even major southern media paid attention to the open hatred.
You've got to keep the white and the black separate.
And the violent response to peaceful protest.
If you're going to beat us in the light of day. Beat us while the camera's on. Beat us while the camera's on.
Michael King was being covered on the news and was given invitations to the White House and was doing marches. I mean, the media, they even took you in his church, seeing him as a church minister preaching. Now, the crazy thing is that you really don't know the gospel that he preached, because I assure you, it has nothing to do with the gospel that's in the Bible. But because he was behind a pulpit, he had to be a Christian. And so if he was talking about God, they believed it had to be God's will. But he was a known leader in the black community, and they were looking for one. I mean, he debated white men on television. He had clout. So during the civil rights era, they were televising the segregation. In the news media, they were giving out the views from everyone. All of a sudden, people's personal opinions were being televised as national news. So people watching it began to be moved by them. Like this right here. This was a school meeting when parents were worried about integration after Brown v. Board of Ed. They were talking and asking questions, and the narrator was speaking about their real thoughts.
The real questions are the ones people don't like to talk about in public, but they come out one way or another.
I would like to know what percentage of white and Negro students that will be going to our school.
He's heard that Negroes are taking over the neighborhood.
Is our school going to be able to keep its high standards?
She's been told that Negroes are less intelligent than whites.
I'd like to know what our school plans on doing about things like social dancing.
He's worried about intermarriage.
This kind of content on your television as a young Negro probably started to irritate you, especially when you heard a leader saying that there was something you could do about it. Imagine watching the television and people talking like this.
The whole thing centers around the word integration. Well, as Mr. Myers said, because his home has been anything but peaceful since he moved in. He's got 3 children, and evidently he feels that they will be accepted socially. And I don't feel that they ever will be. But the whole trouble with this integration business is that in the end, it probably will end up with mixing socially. And you will have, well, I think their aim is mixed marriages and becoming equal with the whites. But the only way they're going to do that is by education and by bettering themselves, not by pushing in the way they have here.
Yeah, it was bothersome. It began to get the attention of the youth because they were watching it on television, and so they began to get involved. You have to understand, in reality, what was actually happening, it was theater, all theater. It was orchestrated and planned between Prince Hall Masons, the Boule, and the white Masons who truly yielded the power in the country. But the public, they had no clue of this. They just watched this happen in real time and began to get attached, and they mobilized. Like I said earlier, the children went to college and were recruited for the cause. They actually trained themselves to deal with what was going on. It was apparent that whoever was in charge of Michael King, they told him that his movement could not move through violence. The colleges were a good place for recruitment. So Michael King, he trained the younger generation to lock arms and to do sit-ins and to deal with the hate and not react to it. They were actually trained to think that this was actual power, not ever really knowing that there was actually real workings behind the scenes in their lodges. That generation today still believes that, and they follow that, locking arms like they're doing something. This was all heavily mind-controlled thought by those with power against those without it. They had the youth do sit-ins where they were attacked. They had white and black students participate in what was called freedom rides, and they took buses to the South and sat in and protested. And of course, there was violence. The whites were unhappy, and they spoke about it on television. All these voices were now on television, and they used the coverage on the news to bring about the outrage. Now, on top of that, and I'll get more into this later, the actual television programs, they were talking about race too. So the younger ones that were watching these programs, they were receiving new programs and new messages to their psyche. And so when they started hearing this hate, it went against what they were hearing on the television. But I'll get to that. Let me go back more. Let's get to Birmingham. In the early 1960s, Birmingham, Alabama was one of the most racially divided cities in the United States. Racism was enforced both legally and culturally. Black citizens faced legal and economic disparities and violent retribution when they attempted to draw attention to their problems. Michael King called it the most segregated city in the country. Protests in Birmingham began with a boycott led by Shuttlesworth meant to pressure business leaders to open employment to people of all races and end segregation in public facilities, restaurants, schools, and stores. When local business and governmental leaders resisted the boycott, the SCLC, which is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, this was Michael King's organization. This was a Negro civil rights organization that Michael was the first president of. They agreed to assist. Organizer Wyatt T. Walker joined Birmingham activist Shuttlesworth and began what they called Project C, a series of sit-ins and marches intended to provoke mass arrests. They were provoking this. They wanted this to happen. When the campaign ran low on adult volunteers, it said James Bevel thought of the idea of having students become the main demonstrators in the Birmingham campaign. He then trained and directed high school, college, and elementary school students in nonviolence and asked them to participate in the demonstration by taking a peaceful walk 50 at a time from the 16th Street Baptist Church to City Hall in order to talk to the mayor about segregation.
Bevel would turn down the lights and show a movie from the sit-in movement in Nashville.
I saw a bunch of coloreds sitting on the stools. They looked like they were just trying to egg on a fight.
Stark reality of nonviolence being met with violence was shocking and scary, and it drew kids in by the hundreds.
Bevel would tell us, Miss Cotton would tell us, if you cannot restrain from being violent, maybe the movement was not for you.
Get knocked on. You really got to think real hard and twice. Because the fellas down on 15th Street, those fellas would fight back. They came to fight. But because of Dr. King and them girls, they would say, y'all come on, cooperate. We need a peaceful protest. They were ready to hit the streets.
Kelly Ingram Park was the big green buffer between black Birmingham and the white downtown. 16th Street Baptist Church was on one corner, and by noon, Birmingham's finest were on the other. It was all laid out like a battlefield.
To think about it now, I get the shakes. What could have happened?
Martin Luther King spent the day at his motel, wrestling with his conscience.
A lot of people thought the kids were going to get hurt. But the reality of it was that we were born black in Alabama, and we were going to get hurt if we didn't do something.
When noon came and went without a public appearance by King, Bevel opened the floodgates. They came out in waves of 50.
The first 50 came out, he peacefully arrested them, and that does it. And the next 50 shows up, then the next 50.
He took young children and put them right into violence. This resulted in over 1,000 arrests. And as the jails and holding areas filled with arrested students, the Birmingham Police Department, at the direction of the City Commissioner of Public Safety, Eugene Bull Connor, they used high-pressure water hoses and police attack dogs on the children and adult bystanders. Anybody that was there could get it. This was all televised, which is why I show the footage. I have that footage. I use this footage all the time. When people talk about the curses of Deuteronomy chapter 28, they only want to talk about slavery, but they conveniently leave out all this history that this group of people went through. Anyways, Michael King Jr. and the SCLC drew both criticism and praise for allowing children to participate and putting these children in harm's way. The adults were not happy with what Michael King was doing. The Birmingham campaign was a model of nonviolent, direct action protest, and through the media, it drew the world's attention to racial segregation in the South. It also polished King's reputation. It ousted Connor from his job, it forced desegregation in Birmingham, and directly paved the way for the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited racial discrimination in hiring practices and public services throughout the United States. It was this televised event, this one right here, that led to the change, and they used the baby boomer generation to do it. Some of the children, as young as 8 and 9, were hosed down and attacked. Now, please understand, it's not like this was not happening before. the attacks, the lynchings, without a mob or protest. The difference, it was happening on television. There wasn't commentary being given that told people what to think. The younger baby boomer generation, black and white, were now responsible for the new world being presented and created. It still was under the banner of white supremacy, but the overall thought was, take your foot off the Negro. And pretty soon after this, there was movement. The March on Washington happened in 1963. Kennedy was assassinated, Johnson was president, and 9 months later, they passed the Civil Rights Act. And the baby boomers, they felt personally responsible for the change that occurred when they saw the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed. They were, and still are, completely unaware of the shadow workings that pushed this agenda to happen. They don't get it because they only think about it in regards to their skin color. They don't really know who they are. You see, there was no longer any need to exclude the Negro. In order for the new world to be built, now that they were mentally in control of the Negroes, they needed to include them in society and attach them to Babylon's agenda, which we can see clear evidence of today.
They will not be able to turn back the clock. They want to stop blacks from voting. We're going to vote anyhow. No matter how hard you make it, we coming anyhow. They're going to try to put women back in the kitchen with an apron. We're not going back in the kitchen. We're not putting the apron back on. They're trying to tell gays get back in the closet. We're not going back in the closet. We're going to lock the closet. We're going to stand up for who we are and where we are and what we are. Our fathers fought for this, and we're going to maintain it. 60 years ago, Martin Luther King talked about a dream. 60 years later, we're the dreamers.
They didn't need to exclude them. They needed them to be a part of what they were doing. So it's time to bring them together. A people who were once heavily in the church and had conservative values had chosen politics over their faith, and that started here at the Civil Rights Movement. If you wonder why so many Negro parents and grandparents vote for these liberal agendas, gay rights, abortion, feminism, it's all because of this event in 1964 that they're so attached to. This agenda was selling their soul to their masters, but I'm sure they don't see it that way. We're talking about this people who were brought here involuntarily, were forced to serve as slaves for hundreds of years. And now they were demanding to be a part of these same people, not really knowing anything about them. They just wanted to be equal because they were told that they were nothing. They were told that it was all about their skin color, why they were hated, and they just wanted to be accepted despite the fact that they were black. I mean, that's just complete garbage when you really think about this whole agenda. Either way, they were manipulated by sellouts who were attached to the enemy and were used by the enemy to make these people attach themselves to a system and a people that were against the Most High. They were led by Michael to look for the promised land, and that land was not a promise from Yahuwah, but it was a promise to be a part of this country, and so this is their religion. And they don't know anything else because the black church was completely built around this. Equal rights and economic prosperity is the religion of the black church, and they're completely lost. They were mind controlled to put their civil rights and equality and tie it to their faith. This is what the baby boomers knew. This is the black churches they grew up under. They didn't grow up under truth and biblical knowledge. They grew up trying to be equal, and that was their religion, and it is their religion. They follow a social gospel. Like I said, what was being preached in the churches was a social gospel. And so they had no real idea on who the God of the Bible is, except that they were to believe in him. And that hypocrisy led to the next wave of why their children and the next couple of generations after began to disavow themselves with the Bible, because there was clear hypocrisy from their parents. But I don't want to move too fast ahead of myself here. The point is that the civil rights became the religion of the Negro community, and they were controlled and steered by it. And after everything was locked in and set in, they killed Malcolm, who's going off script, and they killed Michael, making him a martyr and locking in his movement in which he could never repent from or change. He was locked in, and the fact that they killed him, it solidified his movement in the eyes of the world. This is all high-level sorcery and witchcraft broadcasted over the television sets, and it took a hold of the baby boomers, who were the ones who were raising the generations who would be preparing for the beast, my generation and my children's. So as we see what went on in this history, as you start to look at your parents and your grandparents and wonder why they vote for liberalism, even though they say they're Christian,
Especially those moments and especially those moments when this campaign was at its lowest ebb, the African American community stood up again for me. You've always had my back, and I'll have yours.
It is this moment in time that led them here, and they have not woken up to what truly occurred. And they just look at it as they're still a part of that fight today that they were witnessing when they were children watching it on television. So anytime they hear about someone or like a politician, somebody high up being racist, it triggers them right back into the 60s. This is severe mind control. They don't know how to look past it. Soon as the news points out a racist, they attack while they support their enemy. It's crazy. So when people like Obama came on the scene, they were the first to jump at it, and of course, the whole agenda was made for them. The situation with Obama was different because they felt that they were responsible for it. They felt all their hard work and protesting and voting within the system that it finally paid off. From the slave house to the White House, many of them said. But this was ridiculous because they literally knew nothing about how this country and this world truly worked. They just knew what they were mentally directed to believe since they were born. And so when Obama came on the scene, they voted for him because he was black, nothing more. He was set to continue the dream of Michael King. They didn't know his politics. They didn't care. They knew it was their chance. This was strong mind control. Then after Obama, Trump gets elected, who they were already trained to dislike because of his daddy. The minute it was time to turn on the hate, labels of racist were given, racism was brought in, and they were manipulated and moved so much by hate that they started voting against their faith, actually denouncing it, because they were trying to receive a promise of this world rather than a promise from Yah. And please, do not misunderstand me. I'm not a Trump supporter and I don't care about Trump. I'm just talking about your mental programming. Don't let it get to you, please. I'm not a Trump supporter. I don't care about any of that. I'm not with that system. I hope you understand that. What I'm trying to explain is mental manipulation of a generation that was the guinea pigs to severe mind control. If you watch parts 1 and 2, all this should be clear. People still argue today that this was all about God's plan. Or someone in the comments said the other month, I agree, except for some of your views on civil rights and politics. How do you know that God didn't lead those people into taking steps to fight for our rights? We don't. If they didn't fight, we would still be in slavery. We fight for rights without putting it as a priority over worshiping God. So I try to explain to her that the reason I know is because it didn't align with prophecy. But they didn't want to hear that because of the world that they wanted to believe in. That generation believed that Yah was in the mix when it was actually Satan using his minions of Freemasons and Boule puppets. It was a mental psyop that the people were suckered into believing. And because they never actually knew Yah more than they knew religion, they wrapped their understanding of God into these events. They followed a mind-controlled narrative and agenda that was set for them that they had no idea of. They had no idea of reality. They had no idea who these people truly were behind the doors. What these people were actually said and what they did when the cameras were off. What they did in secret. They knew nothing about these true agendas or our so-called leaders. They believed the news and what they were told, and they believed in the overall goodness of the government. And you need to know and understand that these thoughts were all placed in there by the television since they were young, and their job was to live through this programming and pass it down to the generations after them. It's all mind control. And here's the hard reality. The thing is that, yes, they were manipulated, obviously, but they still will be found guilty because they did not seek out Yah for themselves in his word. They had the word in their hands, but they followed man. They followed others who said they know him, but in reality, those others were leading them falsely, like 2 Corinthians 11 says. For such are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into apostles of Messiah. And no wonder, for Satan himself transforms himself into an angel of light. Therefore, it is no great thing if his ministers also transform themselves into ministers of righteousness, whose end will be according to their works. 2 Corinthians 11, 13 through 15. And so, the civil rights movement was made entirely possible from the mind control of the television that was in 90% of the homes in America. It wasn't just the TV journalism that assisted with the change, but they also started making programs that included race and other themes that got the white community, particularly the baby boomer generation, to start looking at things differently, like I was talking about earlier. The TV began to tackle serious issues like race. They were being primed for it. In the 60s television show like The Twilight Zone, it often told stories of racism.
You know what the blackness is? It's the hate he felt, the hate you felt, the hate all of us feel, and it's too much of it. It's just too much.
The TV show Star Trek, it addressed the notion of a time where social evolution had eradicated prejudice and mankind possesses no bias whatsoever. In 1968, that space-age series even featured the television's first interracial kiss. The television started changing the minds and hearts in society on the idea of race. And though the older generations protested against these things, the younger generations began to soften up. Was racism done away with? I mean, far from it. But they began to accept ideas of equality and rights, even though white supremacy still said that they were the ultimate race. And that doctrine is still subtly believed in today.
What is y'all's race or ethnicity?
Caucasian. Caucasian.
I could have guessed. If you guys could be one race for a day, what would you be and why?
We're the superior race. Not as in like that.
And this was the real story of the civil rights movement. Look past the media and the mainstream. This was mental manipulation on a generation primed and used as puppets. This is the truth about the civil rights movement. Now, last point of mind control that I'm going to bring up from the 60s is with women's rights, gender equality, and feminism. In part 2, I broke down exactly what the 1950s was like after the war before television was mainstream. Once the war was over, traditional roles were reaffirmed. Men were expected to be the breadwinners. Women, even when they worked, assumed their proper place was at home. In the 1950s, the nuclear family was the norm. It consisted of a young husband, who more than likely was a war veteran, and his wife, who had settled into the suburban tract house and began to add to the family they had started the previous decade. All Americans, whether from the city, the suburb, or the small town, were expected to look a certain way and neatly fit into the mainstream. The husbands and fathers were the breadwinners, while the wives and mothers stayed at home, cleaned the houses, cooked the meals, and raised the children. Teens and young adults dated and went steady, which was a prerequisite to becoming engaged. They were expected to marry, start families, and assume the same domestic roles as their elders. This was the 1950s. And this was the way of life millennia before this. This was the family structure. The Bible says, "Wives, submit to your own husbands as to Yahuwah. For the husband is the head of the wife, as also Messiah is the head of the church, and he is the savior of the body. Therefore, just as the church is subject to Messiah, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything." It's Ephesians chapter 5, verses 22 through 24. There was a wave of feminism that started earlier, but this overall view was not challenged in a great deal until the 1960s. And if you can't see how controlled people are, I don't know what will prove it to you. Understand, this generation was named Baby Boomer because of the amount of children the silent generation, their parents, began to have. There was a baby boom. So, do you know what slowed the baby boom down? Television. Let me show you. It first starts with birth control.
In this morning's Health Watch, 50 years of the pill. This week is the golden anniversary of the birth of birth control, a medical breakthrough that has changed society and the sexual landscape forever. Today, it still has critics, but about 100 million women around the world use it to control when and how many times they become pregnant.
Well, the invention of the birth control pill revolutionized life for women in America. It's completely changed women's options.
The pill promised to free women from biological bonds, and it did just that. In the 1950s, women made up about a third of the workforce. Today, women hold nearly half of all U.S. jobs. In the 1950s, American women on average had 3.8 children. Today, that number has dropped to 2.1.
It made them able to pursue higher education, to pursue careers, and to plan the size of their families, which was something they'd never been able to do before.
The approval of a contraceptive pill was approved by the FDA in 1960. Now, this pill called Enovid is said to be a creation of Margaret Sanger and Gregory Pincus. But overall, there's not a lot more on this drug. But like I always say, follow the money. Who was a huge supporter of Margaret Sanger? From their website on the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. The Rockefeller family, especially John D. Rockefeller Jr., was an early advocate of Margaret Sanger's pioneering work in birth control as a means of improving maternal and public health. In 1942, when Sanger's Birth Control Federation of America joined the Planned Parenthood Federation of America, the RBF, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, began its own support for the organization. This was a cause in which founding trustee John D. Rockefeller III took particular interest. Gifts from the fund helped Planned Parenthood launch programs in child spacing, prenatal medical care, public education, and special projects in African American communities. Yeah. The fund significantly contributed to Planned Parenthood's national and New York City-based capital campaigns and enabled the National Research Council's Committee on Human Reproduction, acting as Planned Parenthood's research arm, to increase knowledge about infertility, maternal and neonatal mortality, clinical disorders, and population issues. RBF support for the organization continued through 1975. So, the Rockefeller family was completely a part of this as well, just so you can understand the control behind the scenes. Do you think that the general public knew this? No, of course not. But they still follow the agendas pushed on them. Anyways, the contraceptive pill was a game changer for feminism. It gave women more control over their reproductive rights, and within 5 years, around 6 million women were using it. Of course, this was televised.
I was willing to try anything that would give me life opportunities.
Which is how so many women began to take it in the first place. This pill was the first step in giving women control over their life. It was science interfering with Yah's design. Women didn't have to just be someone who gave birth to children anymore. She could focus on herself first, then choose when she wanted to start a family. Because the pill was able to put a halt to how Yah designed a woman's body, women felt empowered. They stopped his way like they were curing a cold. But understand, of course, it was not thought of in this way, because the mental programming on the television was all about women power and liberation. Nobody ever cared or thought about Yah. Let's keep discussing feminism. Along with the pill and Margaret Sanger, there was a woman who began to push the feminist movement. Betty Friedan wrote a book in 1963, The Feminine Mystique. The book criticized the post-war belief that a woman's role was to marry and bear children. The book had great reach because it was televised. She was televised. Her televised thoughts were bringing feminism to the attention of everyday women, mothers, and housewives. You have to understand, if the powers that be did not want the feminist movement spread, they would not have aired it or her. She was given a platform because she served an agenda. Now understand this also. The people heard this woman's views and they ate them up. But this woman herself was admittedly an atheist. She admitted that early in life she rejected religion almost entirely. But later feminism brought her back to reclaim her Jewish roots, and she did so proudly. Probably with Kabbalah, but whatever. This nation, which claimed to be a Christian nation, was being led by an atheist. This atheist woman, Betty Friedan, was a leader of thought within the feminist movement. So be clear, it's not that the thoughts of feminism came independently through collective thought. They weren't just thinking around and people just said, yes, this is what we need to be. There were Satanists and atheists who were challenging the ways of Yah, and they were using these women to spark thought, and the way they grew in influence was by the television. Also, the Satanists used science to challenge Yah's power and authority. I'm certain many of you women watching have probably taken birth control before. And I know it was probably never framed in this way ever. But think about it yourself. Who were you taking power away from in order to have more control? You can understand that, and you should think about that. I'm not coming at you. We've all made mistakes. We were all controlled by the system. I'm just trying to get your mind to start working and thinking about the agendas of Satan. Let's keep going, though. Again, it was the younger baby boomer women generation that was eating all this up. It was the baby boomers. It was not the parents. The parents, though maybe they were affected by the programming, they did not spark the change. They were the parents of the baby boomers. That's it. And discussing this feminism, the next person on the scene was Helen Gurley Brown. In 1962, she wrote a book called Sex and the Single Girl. It was published in 28 countries and stayed on the bestsellers list for over a year. In 1964, her book was turned into a movie of the same name, Sex and the Single Girl. In 1965, she became editor-in-chief of Cosmopolitan magazine. then a literary magazine famed for high-tone content, and reinvented it as a magazine for the modern single career woman. In the 1960s, she was an outspoken advocate of women's sexual freedom and sought to provide women with role models in her magazine. So any woman reading this cosmopolitan magazine, this was the influence that she was receiving. Miss Brown claimed that women could have it all: love, sex, and money. She was the new example of the new modern woman. She was a woman who wasn't married, who wasn't dating men, she was having sex, the complete opposite of what women were known to be. But she became a strong voice in the feminist movement. Her work played a part in what is often called the sexual revolution. And this today, if you look at our women today, this is what they're modeled after. This right here, this woman. Although she attended Protestant church services during her youth, as an adult, she dismissed religious faith. She was fond of saying that good girls go to heaven, bad girls go everywhere. These atheists were leading women through their thoughts of rebellion against the Most High, but labeled it under civil rights. These women did not want to be held under the standards of the way of the Most High, and they pushed women to rebel against these standards. And today, women, they don't recognize that this is exactly what they're doing. They're rebelling against the Most High. These thoughts come from atheists, people who reject the Most High. And if you align with them, you're not aligning with the ways of the Most High. You're aligning with people who were against the Most High. And you need to understand that. So as this feminist movement grew, the younger generation, they completely had a changed view about sex and sex before marriage. What we see today with complete lack of care, what I don't even want to show or mention from people like Beyonce, Cardi B, the Kardashians, whoever else is relevant in women culture today, their behavior is only possible because of the movements that these atheist women started. So yes, the young baby boomer generation, they ate it all up. They were more concerned about themselves and their own careers than starting a family, and because now there was a solution that they could use to hold off pregnancy through birth control, they now had more control than ever, and they never let that control and power go, being completely rebellious against the Most High. They wanted and started a revolution between the sexes, and they won. And this is why the family structure was destroyed. But it's important to understand that these thoughts were not gradual thoughts that people just began to think through the evolution of time. This second wave of feminism was only strong because of the television. These women wrote books and they did interviews gaining attention. And then the television networks made their own programming to start pushing these thoughts. They would make programs that dealt with these traditional thoughts and made these thoughts look old-fashioned or ignorant. Like this scene from Leave It to Beaver.
Girls are kind of lucky, don't they, Mom?
Why do you say that?
Well, they don't have to be smart. They don't have to get jobs or anything. All they gotta do is get married.
Well, Beaver, being smart isn't exactly a drawback to marriage.
Well, if they don't get married, well, they can become dressmakers or cut people's nails in a barber shop or take care of kids and a lot of other dumb stuff.
Well, Beaver, today girls can be doctors and lawyers, too, you know. They're just as ambitious as boys are.
You mean there's no dumb people left in the world, Mom?
Do you see how they did it? They made this young kid's thought seem crazy. Now, maybe how he phrased it was, but traditional family roles have been a way of life for thousands of years before this movement. And they just worked to make sure that this way of thinking was looked at as being bad and old. Let's talk about the television. First, they started with Bewitched, which aired from 1964 to 1972 on ABC. This show was not only something that helped with the feminist movement, it also was a subtle introduction to witchcraft in this country.
After a short recess, we'll deal with the appointment of the new resident witch of Salem. As you well know, this office was created out of the wisdom of the high priestess Hepzibah in the year 1692, dedicated to protect the image of the witch.
It was about a witch who marries an ordinary mortal man and vows to lead the life of a typical suburban housewife.
So I'll just have to prove to you that I'm a witch.
That's a good idea. Prove it.
I wasn't going to do any more witchcraft for your sake.
The show was popular, finishing as the second-rated show in America during its debut season, staying in the top 10 for its first 3 seasons. It was one of the first, apparently, feminist television shows, one that showcased a wife who clearly had more power than her husband. Her efforts to balance the demands of a suburban housewife with her husband's frail ego and her own supernatural abilities charted a course for women weighing the challenges of home, heart, and their own awakening ambitions. This goes back to what I explained with Edward Bernays. They started to play subtle thoughts in while keeping it in the same traditional roles. But they made her a witch and said that she was more powerful than him, so obviously she was lowering herself down for the husband. But she always would show that she had more power. The next show was I Dream of Jeannie, which was an American fantasy sitcom series also on ABC from 1965 to 1970. This was another show of the same subtle way of Bewitched, but instead of her being a clear witch, she was a genie, there to make the man's wishes come true. Though she is devoted to him and his life and calls him her master, she clearly is the most powerful one. And in this series, they began to introduce the thoughts of feminism.
I'm reading a scroll, The Emancipation of Modern Woman. What does it mean?
Jeannie, oh, you don't have to worry about things like that.
Hiya, Master. How's the old boy?
How's the old boy? What have you been doing?
I've been doing nothing.
Yeah, well, I know that, but I mean, what have you been doing?
I have been studying the emancipation of modern woman.
Oh, that. I guess you got so caught up in it you forgot to do the housework, huh?
Oh, I did not forget. I decided to let you do it.
What, me?
How not to be a drudge. Share the work with him.
Now, come on. Now,
That's what it says.
Yeah, but that advice is for ordinary women. Now, you're not ordinary women. You're a genie, Jeannie.
And they began to introduce these thoughts to younger women. They even showed not to accept the man when he is not agreeing with this. The last show I'll deal with in the 60s was the TV show That Girl. This was a TV series sitcom that ran on ABC from 1966 to 1971. This series did not speak to feminism indirectly. It went directly at the heart of feminism right during the rise of the change in the feminist movement. It starred Marlo Thomas as the main character, Anne Marie. She was an aspiring actress who moved from her hometown of Brewster, New York, to try to make it big in New York City. It was one of the first sitcoms to focus on an unmarried woman who was not domestic or living with her parents. The show reflected the changing roles of American women in the feminist era of America. Off-screen, her role influenced millions of women to take charge of their own lives. This at the time when the country was feeling the first jolts of this new feminist movement. They literally made content to give women the example that they should aspire to be like. This was not a coincidence. This is how you know it was mind control. If you look at ABC's method, they started with The Witch in 1964, then I Dream of Jeannie in 1965, onto That Girl in 1966. There was a progression. These were attempts at displaying the thoughts women should have, and that they needed to start embracing this revolution, and it was the younger baby boomer generation that started to embrace it. So let's understand it through statistics. In 1950, the divorce rate in the United States was 2.5 divorces for every 1,000 people. In 1955, it dropped to 2.3. In 1958, the rate slumped even to 2.1, with 368,000 divorces. In 1960, the rate started to go back up. It was 2.2 per 1,000 Americans, and by 1965, it went back to 2.5 that it was at 1950, so it went right back. By 1969, the rate jumped to 3.2, with 639,000 divorces. In 1970s, the annual rate of divorce was 3.5 per 1,000. But by the end of that decade, it reached 5.1 divorces per 1,000. This mental programming was real and on purpose. Women were mentally programmed to rebel against the roles the Most High established for the family, and they wanted a life that fulfilled their own ways and desires, and now today, this way of thought just seems to be normalized, and speaking against it is deemed as out of touch and oppressive. This thought was not decreased, but heavily increased, and we can see this over time as we go through the mind control. But the point I've been trying to make should be made clear by now. This second wave of feminist values was started by women who did not believe in God. They were anti-Yah and anti-Messiah, provoking rebellion against the ways of the Most High. But they were given a platform and they used it. Those that control the television networks made a decision to give rise to these thoughts at the same time where their birth control drugs became approved. This was a complete agenda that was programmed into the baby boomer generation. And the evidence does not lie when we follow the statistics of what happened just a decade later. The rise of divorce pretty much doubling and climbing, and that is not even counting the difference in the age when men and women started getting married. There was an obvious change, and today, people think that this was natural evolution.
People have been getting married for thousands of years. It's an ancient institution, but for some people, it's perhaps a bit too ancient. 89% of the world's population now live in countries with falling marriage rates. This is especially pronounced in the richest countries. Among the 38 OECD nations, most recorded between 7 and 10 marriages per 1,000 people in 1970. By 1995, this fell to around 5 to 7 marriages, and it continues to plummet today. So why is this happening, and will it spell the end of marriage as we know it? A stable marriage has often been associated with financial stability. Married households in the US hold significantly higher wealth than cohabiting couples or singles. But despite this, the marriage rate in the US has dropped by nearly 60% since the 1970s. And the median age for first-time marriages has increased for both women and men.
But the truth is that all these thoughts are just results of heavy mind control gauged against the unsuspecting public, and today we suffer from these mental attacks waged long ago. Millions of young women started to follow these women's thoughts, and they wanted to create a revolution between the relationship of man and woman. They were not told that these thoughts came from atheist women who were anti-Christ. Their thoughts were made popular and were made to be widely accepted. But the funny thing is that the feminist movement assisted with the civil rights movement because it was moving in with its own agenda.
Well, the main demand, of course, is equal rights. Equal rights to have a job, to have respect, to not be viewed as a piece of meat. Equal rights to set forth our own humanity. Equal rights to get into graduate programs, to get into schools, to training programs. We're the bottom third of the employment in terms of pay.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited discrimination based on race, religion, color, or national origin in public places, schools, and employment. Discrimination based on sex was not initially included in the proposed bill, and it said that it was only added as an amendment in Title VII in an attempt to prevent its passage, but it passed anyway. They added it in because this was the overall civil rights bill riding the curtail of equal rights for racial relations. Those following the civil rights agenda destroyed their families in the process by putting man in place of these decisions. All of this was done because of mind-controlled thought that has been overlooked throughout our time, and it is imperative that we wake up and see just how much we have been influenced. This was just the beginning stages of the mind control, but it was the foundation that ushered us into the world that we're in right now. The truth is, if you examine your thoughts about this world, and if they are aligned in the mainstream, your views are just products of mind control that was waged against the population. Your thoughts are not your own. They were mind controlled and implanted by decades of influence. It's possible that you agree with the majority of these agendas and you're happy for them, and that's your choice. But let me be abundantly clear. Those who are aligned into the world matrix, that is the strong delusion, you're against the Most High and you'll be judged for it. If you don't agree, that's okay, that's on you. I'm going to end these videos in the same manner as I spoke in the first part because the point is important. When people reject Yahusha, there's a major thought that most people say. They say, Christianity is a tool of control. Well, yes, the way it has been taught in America, it definitely was. I mean, I don't even like the term Christianity, so I agree with you. Then there's people speaking against the Bible, saying the Bible is a tool of control. And yeah, the way it was used in the past, people definitely used it in this way, but they also did not allow people to read it for themselves. But there's no denying that it was used for control. But for people that still hold that view, please tell me why the same people that control the world now, why didn't those same people that are controlling us stop using the Bible for their control if they were already controlling us with the Bible? They could have if they wanted to, but they didn't. They created mindsets that were completely against the Bible, completely opposite. They didn't have Bible programs on the television where people were just hearing Bible verses all day. No, what they actually used as a tool of control, you now have it in your hand and you love it. While the one thing that can actually set you free, you have been programmed to believe that this is the control. And that's the problem. You need to get a hold of your thoughts and stop being controlled. I mean, if you're going to be taken down, at least let it be your own decision and not because you're controlled to think the way you do. The Bible has warned us against this trick. And if we actually read the Bible and did not speak against it, maybe this agenda wouldn't have been able to go so far. We are told, and do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of Elohim. Romans chapter 12, verse 2. How could you be taken advantage of if you actually believe that? We're told, for though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in Elohim for pulling down strongholds, casting down arguments, and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of Elohim, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Messiah. That's 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 3 through 5. If we were bringing our thoughts into obedience of Messiah, then these agendas would not be able to exist. And remember, no temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man. But Elohim is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape that you may be able to bear it. That's 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13. These thoughts that we all have must be analyzed and reviewed. And the more you see other people's influence in your mind, the more I pray it gives you the strength to scrutinize all these thoughts and bring them into captivity to the obedience of Messiah. That's the only way the devil can allow you to break free, is if you come under the obedience of Messiah. You don't do it on your own. We are in the last days, and if you're going to be ready for Yah's kingdom, you must not be in the strong delusion. As you wait between these videos, please make sure that you take the personal time to reintroduce yourself to Yahuwah through his word and cast down all strongholds in the name of Yahusha. I have a spiritual warfare prayer in the description box. I pray that helps you. It's time, though, to wake up and fight for your mind. These warnings will not be around forever. Please do this through the power of our Messiah and let his truth set you completely free. Be blessed. Hallelujah. Praise Yah. Okay, thanks again for watching. If this has blessed you, please don't forget to like this and share this video with others. Please send this video to anyone that you know. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to this channel. Yah willing, I upload every Friday. Please don't forget to follow this ministry on Facebook and Instagram, as well as on my website, truthunedited.com. If you no longer see this channel on this platform, please look for my videos on my website, truthunedited.com. I thank you for watching. I'm thankful for all of you. Thank you especially to those Elohim has placed it on your hearts to give, and you have done so. I thank you for your assistance in carrying out this ministry every week. Thank you for your blessings and your prayers. They truly support this ministry. Thank you for your obedience to Yah's call on your heart. Okay, thanks again everyone for watching. I love you all.